Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this introduction of myself and also of the talk I am giving today. I would like to say that my concerns are not only focused on Poland. As all of us know, the wave of new populism is present all over. I just came back after 1 month stay in the US, and of course, all Americans, not all, but the considerable part of Americans is concerned with populism in the US, especially represented by the presidency of Donald Trump and his very populistic legitimacy in the US. So that wave of new populism, I think, is present in many other countries, especially in Europe, but also in America, and also Brexit, for me, is one of the indicators of populism in the United Kingdom. So this is not limitations special to my presentation. Before I will, however, I will start with the presentation itself. I would like to say something about the university I am working with. Because the Jagiellonian University it is not only one of the oldest in Central Europe, as I mentioned, the Prague University, Charles University in Prague, is older 4 years than the Jagiellonian University, so they have the primacy in this respect at least. But there is some specific point connected with the Jagiellonian University is that it was founded by a woman. And that was a queen of, and there was a woman who was a king of Poland. So she was not a queen as a wife of the king, but she was a king of Poland. And she was crowned when she was 12 years old. And being 17 years old, she already gave all her jewelry to found a university in Poland. She was a very well-educated woman in the 15th century and was very engaged in education, so that is a university, I think the only one in Europe, which was founded by a woman. The name, however, came from her husband, who was a king of Poland after she got married to him. And the name, he was a Lithuanian prince, the name was Jagiello, and therefore the name Jagiellonian University, so it was one example of this exclusion of women from the public sphere that is also illustrated by the name of my university. Therefore, I am also not only engaged in the functioning of public sphere and also the legal structure and normative structure of the public sphere, but also I am teaching a subject which is called gender and law, and that is mostly devoted to feminism and law, which is a sociology of law as a matter of fact, so it is not very far from sociology. And now I am coming to my talk. It won't be pinpoint presentation, it will be simply a talk, and the title, Civil Society, Democracy and the Wave of New Populism, already illustrates the difficult methodological point connected with that presentation, namely all of those concepts as you see them are value and normative ladder. So they are not purely, let's say, descriptive concepts, they are not purely theoretical, but they are always norms connected with the meaning of each of them, especially civil society, new populism, or the democracy too, as I will try to demonstrate in my presentation. They are value-laden and normatively they're underpinned, what means that their meaning is changing across time and space. So each time when you use in your work and your projects any of them, either it will be civil society or democracy and populism, so you try to contextualize those concepts and apply them in the given social, political, and structural, especially context. So the structures and meanings as well as agency which are involved in all of them have this strong normative underpinning and time and spatial underpinning, and one shall not forget about it when one uses those concepts especially in research projects, but also in conceptualizations of them. So I will start with let's say, the most popular of them. I will start with the concept of democracy, and then after critics of the approaches to democracy, and especially research on democracy, I will come to new populism and civil society, both the other two of them. So starting with some obvious, starting with some classic works and some obvious conceptualization, I will start with one of the most important books on democracy. It was written by political scientists, but this is also very popular in political sociology especially. So start with this book of Samuel Huntington, The Third Way. In his book, The Third Way, Democratization in the Late 20th Century, political scientist Samuel Huntington referred to the third major surge of democracy in history. Huntington described global democratization as coming in three waves. I will stress this term global democratization because that is some kind of assessment which should be yet proved. The first wave of democracy began in the early 19th century when the suffrage was granted to the majority of white males in the US, and afterwards, at the end of 19th century, also in other countries. And that resulted in, according to the numbers, it resulted in 29 democracies in the world. The second wave began after the Second World War and lasted, according to Huntington, to the mid-70s, 1970s, and resulted in 36 democracies. And the third wave started, it was roughly at the very beginning of 1970s, and then it included Southern Europe, especially Portugal and Spain, Latin American countries in 80s, and Asia-Pacific countries like Philippines, South Korea, and Taiwan, and also later some African countries. And in the 1990s, what is quite well known, the former Union and Eastern European countries, so this region is included into this third wave of democracy, and the number of democracies grew at that time considerably. Experts referring also to the fourth wave, which of democracy, and point to the collapse of several dictatorships in Middle East and North Africa. This thesis on democratic waves came to strong criticism on part of political sciences, but especially on part of sociologists. This criticism has important theoretical support, to which I will go later, and it is based on a very strong empirical evidence. To start with some theoretical part of the criticism, I think that this very critical point of this conceptualization of democracy by Huntington refers to an assessment that the number of democracies grows and will grow. And that is a kind of a metaphysical assessment, because we never know whether the number of democracies will grow, and that will be something like the happy end of the history. In the result, every country will end in democracy, or that is simply an idealistic idea that the number of democracies will grow over time. And the empirical, so that is the first part of the theoretical criticism. I will come to the more important one in some minutes. But starting from the second, the empirical, which is somehow obvious and trivial, it is not difficult to demonstrate that democratic waves are stopped, and even they can retreat, and retreat from democracy is possible. Democracy itself, according to democratic rules, can end into its own reverse. In place of new democracies, new dictatorships or authoritarian systems emerged. That was historically the case of Italy, when democracy ended in a fascist regime of Mussolini. In Portugal, when democracy, which just started, returned to some, it was a kind of a backlash, and returned to the authoritarian government of Salazar. Spain, it was after Democratic Republic, which ended in civil war, and then the regime of Franco was installed. And I think that the most prominent example of that retreat and reversal of democracy was Germany, when after the Weimar Republic, the regime of National Socialistic Party under the leadership of Hitler was installed. And that one did not only the reverse waves, but it is something like installment of a government, of a regime which is opposite, which presents, as I had already said, a kind of a backlash to democratic government. The recession of democratic waves, or the reverse waves, were present or took place in a number of Latin American countries. One shall mention nowadays Venezuela as a good example, but there were many others before. And most recently, in the Eastern European countries, and presently also, as we all know, in Middle East and North Africa. So, then I'm coming to the empirical, to the theoretical important criticism of this assessment of democratic waves, and I will focus on two concepts of democracy. One of them is represented by political scientists and political sociologists such as Adam Przeworski, who is a Polish origin but is American professor of sociology, I think at Chicago University. Yeah. And so I am coming to two conceptualization of democracy, which I call, one of them is the thin conceptualization, and the other one a rich conceptualization. According to my thesis, this assessment of this, let's say, enlarging scope of democracies could be criticized exactly because it is based on the thin conceptualization, and one does not look inside more important theoretical underpinnings and life words of people who are presenting an agency either in the wave of democratization or in the wave of recession of democracy. So I call that thin conceptualization of democracy, I call that purely majoritarian or statistical, when no norms are taken into consideration and no values connected with democracy, but purely statistical and majoritarian characteristics of this political system. So, according to my thesis and according to my argument, that the statistical democracies may easily turn into their own contradiction. It can happen gradually or abruptly. The most evident or prominent case of this reversal from democracy into something quite opposite to it was the case of pre-war Germany, and it is the case also of contemporary Poland and Hungary after the members of those third wave of democratization. In both cases, and especially of Poland and Germany, pre-war Germany and contemporary Poland, there are very similar, let's say, numbers involved, very similar statistics. So, in both cases, due to great electoral absenteeism, was more than 50% of the whole electorate who was not taking part in elections, important elections. And the procedural rule of the parliamentarian majority formation, so nothing more is needed for democracy, as parliamentarian majority, and there are some other conditions, but they are also limited to numbers, to statistics. The eventual parliamentarian majority was in fact chosen by the minority of the electorate, and that minority represented very undemocratic agency, undemocratic agenda and undemocratic agency. As it was also very similar where the numbers which chosen the government. So in Germany it was about less than 20% of the whole electorate who had chosen the nationalistic party at that time, and in the early 30s, and in Poland it was a little bit less, but not much less than 19% of the whole population, which chosen the contemporary Polish government and the ruling party. Nevertheless, because of the extensive social programs, as well as by the appeals to social resentiments, fears especially, and scares, it was, and because of the appeals or creation of the enemy of democracy, which is focused on anti-elitism, racial and ethnic hatred, and skillful manipulation of the mass communication, I will call the one which is called the negative PR, those democratic, but actually non-democratic forms of government are winning a considerable social support. That was the case of Germany, pre-war Germany, when at the beginning the rest of the population was not so very friendly toward the government formed in the early 30s, but gradually, because of the social program and because of this creation of social hatred and those resentiments which were involved in propaganda and mass communication at that time, those parties and those governments, that government in Germany won a considerable social support, and coming closer to the Second World War, that support was considerably large. And that is also the case of Poland. As I have said, at the beginning the government was chosen only by slightly less than 19% of the population. Now, according to the recent public opinion polls, is supported by the 44%. So that gradual support is growing of this anti-democratic, of the democratic government, what furtherly contributes to the reverse of democratic government in Poland. This specific combination of extensive social programs and the appeals to popular resentiments and skillful propaganda, skillful public discourse, focus on hatred in the contemporary world may present the contemporary form of populism. And that contemporary form of populism, extensive social programs, and especially appeals to resentiments, to the exclusion of specific social groups, are characteristic. I think that they are universal features of populism, not only in this country. They are very, let's say, very much present in the American public discourse, the government of President Donald Trump is very skillful in manipulation. There, that excluded social group, which are mostly purely educated, rather not only old, but purely educated white males, because that is the slogan, make America white again, great again. That is appeals to those not very well educated workers, white. So that is a hatred toward others coming to the United States. What is growing, it is this social distance and mental distance to immigrants. It's also characteristic for American public discourse. Nowadays it is very well illustrated by the research on public discourse. So that new forms of populism are spreading all over and are characteristic not only of East Central Europe. I can mention, because I am looking at Philomene, so that the Philippines are also the very good illustrating example of that retreat from democracy and growing populism with considerable and growing social support. Also, one can mention here appeals to economic social grievances and fulfillment of the most fundamental but skillfully orchestrated social claims, accompanied, as I have said, by creating the enemies, which are the elites, the system, people in Washington. That was this is very popular part of the public discourse in the US. Gender, race, strangers, refugees. That is all over Europe and elsewhere. And therefore, the conceptualization of democracy, taking this empirical evidence into consideration, one can conclude that the conceptualization of democracy in the purely majoritarian or statistical terms too easily takes for granted some very thin, temporal, not well rooted in the political culture's forms of government. The statistical terms of the conceptualization of democracy comes from the thin concept of democracy and statistical one is usually used in political sciences, unfortunately, and especially and also in political sociology, as I have mentioned. It derives mainly from the classic definition of democracy of Robert Dahl, which should be contained in polyarchy, multi-party system, and is focused on the concept of contestation and participation. On the rather strong social agenda, as a matter of fact, what means participation, even if that is a participation of the, let's say, smaller, not 50% of electorate, but still it is. In the similar vein, goes Huntington's definition of democracy, and it is based on the level or extent of open, free, and fair elections, limitations of political power, institutionalization, and stability is also here included in the regulations of the European Union. That was applied, there was this test of democratization which was applied to Poland and other new, so-called new members of the European Union, when the government was chosen in a democratic way, what means free elections and multi-party system, which was fulfilled 2 times, in the consecutive 2 times. That means that nation had passed this democratic test because the democracy is already stabilized and sustainable. So also the regulation of widespread voting participation is included in those conceptualization of democracy, and voting participation means that passive and active rights to participate in the democratic process is granted to a considerable part of the population. As a matter of fact, in all of those mentioned countries like Germany, Poland, Belarus, also Hungary and other countries which now experience the retreat from democracy, the voting participation was granted to 100 of electorate. So everybody has passive and active rights, and nevertheless, independently of the fulfillment of that normative criteria, this anti-democratic wave or turn is also possible. So one can conclude that if we stopped by this thin conceptualization of democracy, non-democratic and almost authoritarian or purely authoritarian, overall authoritarian regimes could be chosen in a fully democratic way, and they are supported furtherly by the electorate, as it is the case of many Eastern European countries. I have mentioned Russia and Belarus, or East Central European countries. I have mentioned Hungary and Poland as the most prominent examples. I will come to them later on. And also they were, it was an example, and especially the most, let's say, dramatic one, it was the pre-war Germany. So one shall look for some, let's say, richer or more elaborate and more sociological conceptualization of democracy to look deeper into political process and to be able to explain why it is possible that anti-democratic or purely authoritarian or totalitarian regimes could come into power in effect of democratic process, purely statistical or pure out of this thin, limited to this thin conceptualization of democracy. So in contrast to the thin conceptualization of democracy, one has two propositions, more broader or richer. One of them is legal, and the other one is a sociological conceptualization, which is very much connected to the legal one. In light of those richer conceptualization, not only this thin test should be applied, but one shall look into normative, evaluative legitimizations, political and legal cultures of societies involved in democratic process to assess whether democracy is sustainable and could pass this wave of anti-democratic process with a success, so could sustain those waves. Some of those rules and principles are characteristic of the constitutional conceptualization of democracy, and those constitutional conceptualization, what I mean, promoted by constitutional lawyers. They are also called a liberal conceptualization of democracy, and here I will make some footnote to my speech inspired by the speech of John Helmut, and I would like to say that I am applying the concept and the word liberal in a different meaning, so it is not limited to economic neoliberalism, because for me the concept of liberal and liberalism is very much connected with political philosophy, and this is a political philosophy of freedom. So the liberal means that free elections, freedom of movement, and also protection of the rights and liberties of citizens. So this is a very different concept of liberal as it is used now and only limited, and which is not limited to economic neoliberalism, which is a very poor conceptualization of liberalism. The common feature of those legal and constitutional conceptualization of democracy presents not only the principle of majority rule, which is characteristic of the thin statistical concept of the democratic government, but also many other principles which are now elaborated in constitutions of democratic countries and were elaborated and are debated by constitutional lawyers or philosophers of law mostly. So there are such rules like the majority, not only majority rule, but also the principle of checks and balances, the division of powers, the rule of law as the most primary form of constitutionalism, but also the independence of judiciary, professionalism of the public sphere, but also such rules as the freedom of the media, the equal treatment principle, or non-discrimination better according to the modern conceptualization of that, and freedoms and liberties of every citizens, and nowadays also in democratic liberal constitutions, there are those freedoms and liberties are not only associated with individual, but also with social groups, so they could be collective and not only individual. So, and also for sociologists, what is even equally important are the informal norms, important for the functioning of the public sphere. And when I am talking about those informal norms, I have in mind mostly the civility and the norms of civility, the treatment of the opposite party in the public sphere, and that I will also come to that norm when I will be talking about the civil society and its contemporary incorporations. So in contrast to the simplistic understanding of democracy, it is to the purely majoritarian of statistical conceptualization, the philosophers of law and constitutional law propose a concept of constitutional democracy which is much richer and robust. According to the one of the most prominent of such lawyers, and this is, I am quoting now Ronald Dworkin, a true democracy is a communal democracy, what means that a community is taken into consideration, in which majority decision, when there is some retreat from the purely majoritarian conceptualization, in which majority decision is legitimate only if it is a majority within a community of equals. So, on the one hand, we have this majority rule, of course, supported and proclaimed, but on the other hand, the term of equals is here important because, according to that conceptualization, each member of the society, every community within the society should be treated equally. It means, on the one hand, the inclusion of all members of community. It is the politically organized society. And respect, secondly, respect of equal rights of them, independent of their differences, of the gender, religion, race, ethnicity, etc., any other difference which is important for the community, for the politically organized society living together. On the other hand, that legal definition of democracy refers to the consensus and social contract which legitimize democratic government. It is to, and I am using the concept of another prominent philosopher of law, important for sociologists, to an overlapping consensus that emerges in result of disputes. that is John Rawls' definition. The John Rawls concept that emerges in result of disputes, struggles, and social contracts struck on every level of social functioning. So it is not only this social contract, some kind of a fiction which supports the democratic constitution, but as a matter of fact, this concept of John Rawls refers to each social contract which is struck on any level of the functioning of society, beginning from the bottom or from the top, whenever it begins, but it means that it is reached. So it is supported by those struggles and disputes among members of civil society on every level of social structure, on any level of their functioning. It could be in the family, could be in small social groups, could be on the level of local government, what is especially important, and that reaches to the top as an overall overlapping consensus, which of course is a problem of time and the history of the society. So it is here this temporal aspect of social process is very much taken into consideration. Therefore, the concepts of a community of equals, what means everyone is equal, independently of gender, independently of race, independently of ethnicity, for instance, nowadays, and overlapping consensus imply the further sociologically important concept of inclusion and recognition as a feature of the robust democracy. Inclusion of all citizens and recognition of their rights as the expectations and claims above all of the differences which characterize the modern society. And when one thinks further about this problem of recognition, the contemporary structures of the modern society, the democratic society, recognize, I think, the two types of recognition, and both of them are very much connected to inclusion, so those two terms are very close, according to their meanings, to each other. One of them is a public recognition, and public recognition means that the government recognizes in equal rights of every citizen living within the scope of that government. But that is also mutual recognition, and mutual recognition means that citizens mutually recognize their equality, their equal rights within a politically organized society, politically organized community. Because principles of mutual recognition as well as inclusiveness are deeply associated with the social experiences, mundane experiences, with the life worlds of society, the functioning of democracy in the contemporary world depends on such forms of social organization that could reflect those experiences and signals their abuse. Here, the civil society comes to the stage as an important and even necessary agent enabling the functioning of rich and robust, sustainable democracy. So here we have in mind, so we see such social structure, which is, let's say, has 3 levels, and that is not so, this is a trivial remark, and that tells you some, this type of social structure originated not from myself, it is rather a Jürgen Habermas conceptualization of social structure and this necessary part of the civil society, but I am elaborating more on that concept. So we here see the social structure as composed of 3 levels. One of them is the level of the government chosen by in the democratic way. At the bottom are the live worlds, the mundane live worlds, connected experiences of people which are living within that organized community, their encounters, their experiences with others, their, let's say, experiences with people coming to that community, as well as their involvement in decision making, which is important for the community functioning. And in the middle, there is civil society, which is important both ways. So on the one hand, the civil society is important because of the possible abuse of power. And that was the, let's say, traditional, the classic characteristic of civil society, according to almost all theories which were connected, which dealt with the civil society. So it is a kind of a blowing whistle, how do you call it? Of civil society, when the abuse of power becomes threat to threat the civil rights of citizens. But on the other hand, there is another important part of civil society in a democratic government. It is this way of transmitting these experiences, live words experiences, and expectations of ordinary people to the level of government. So on the other hand, the civil society is necessary not only because of the possible abuse of power, but also necessary in order to the citizens' voices to be heard. So their claims and expectations are transformed to the level of government. So that is also very important, this part, this communicative engagement of civil society from both sides, especially this side from the level of experiences to the government is very important, especially nowadays, and that is, let's say, the spatial and nowadays and in complex societies, the contemporary complex societies, because here the civil society is able to transmit the experiences on the bottom level of the complex and pluralistic society, of those possible differences which are either they are present or they are growing in the contemporary world, especially of differences, different expectations, different vulnerabilities, different claims directed to the government by the very complex and differentiated modern society where the social subjectivity grows of people who were before excluded from the political process. So therefore the civil society is also important for the people in this bottom-up communication process. And now I will, next to, let's say, to activities to the social agency, also those norms which characterize the complex pluralistic modern societies now should be considered according to my concept of the civil society and its role in democracy in the contemporary world. And now I'm coming to some, let's say, problems which are connected with that part, in that region of Europe and that part of the contemporary world, and especially I will tackle a little bit upon those processes in Poland and elsewhere, which once provoked theory, the sociological theory, to once more to consider the civil society as an important sociological issue, but now one looks at those processes and events involved with the developments in this region, and makes one to look skeptical towards the civil society, and I will try to explain why this optimism was justified and the skepticism is also justified, but it could be explained. So that will be, let's say, the debating, concluding part of the presentation. I would, when it was almost 30 years ago already, so you were not born even at that time, but at that time the civil society, the concept of civil society was once more in the history of social sciences considered as an important one, and that was exactly because those events and processes taking place in East Central Europe, and especially because of strong agency, which was at that time then, which was very much visible. And there are many works, and I am quoting many authors at once. So, and the conclusion is that activities of civil society were crucial for the democratic transformation in this region, exactly on the verge of 21st century. So it was 90s of 20th century and the beginning of 21st century, when the civil society was very much visible and its activities were very important, not only for this region, but for the transformation of, let's say, many other regions in the world. Because of the range and scope, that was firstly Central Europe, then Eastern Europe, then new countries emerged, new alignments and realignments were struck, and there's, let's say, the European Union enlarged itself, and those, let's say, those processes were imitated also in other regions of the world. It was, let's say, notably in Middle East and North Africa, according to their activists. So because of their range and scope, as well as their social and political consequences, European and to some extent also global, these events were easily compared to the earlier historical events and processes that took place in Europe and led to the French Revolution. So the one of those important events in Europe was French Revolution and the Declaration of Rights, human rights at that time, and afterwards, at the end of the 20th century, there was another, let's say, important political and social process that led to, let's say, not more or less, but similar consequences. Its more contemporary part, so the more contemporary part to the French Revolution, was a series of relatively peaceful overthrows of communist, totalitarian, authoritarian regimes in Eastern and East Central Europe. The similarity between the revolution in France at the end of 18th century and the peaceful revolution in Eastern Europe consists in the fact that the collapse of the former regime and the installment of a new, more liberal one, liberal in my meaning, was not imposed from above. So it was nothing from above, not philosophers, for instance, and not, let's say, leading politicians, by some enlightened leaders, and not from outside, but like, for instance, the invading army, but by some, predominantly, those processes, events were a result of the working of internal actors, of the masses of people on the streets. The great part in the collapse of feudalism, as well as communism, was plied by society, the third estate in the former case, and the dissidents, and that was some generic terms, dissidents, intellectuals, but also workers, like in Polish case, as well as underground movements and civic organizations in the latter. That was the case of Chapter 77 in the then Czechoslovakia, some ecological movements in Eastern Germany, some religious movements, And that was the huge, as a matter of fact, 10 million strong Solidarność movement in Poland, which was composed of intellectuals and workers. And that was a kind of a, let's say, that was a mutual support in Poland by both of them, and that started a bit earlier than 90s. Indeed, as it was, and it has been observed, and I'm quoting Ulrich Beck, and that was written in 1994, the socially most astonishing and surprising phenomenon was the unexpected renaissance of a political subjectivity outside and inside the institutions. And political subjectivity in these terms mean nothing less as agency, a sociological term. The themes of the future, which are now on everyone's lips, have not originated from the far-sightedness of the rulers or from the struggles in parliament, and certainly not from the cathedrals of power in business, science, and state, so not from above. They have been put on social agenda against the concentrated resistance of this institutional ignorance by entangled, moralizing groups fighting each other over the proper way, split and plucked by doubts. That was a book famous at that time, published by Beck, Gibbons and Lux in 1994, and that book was devoted predominantly to the growing interest in civic society, in social sciences, and the concept of civil society at that time was limited to social agency, social subjectivity and strong agency, which became to be visible on the streets here in Poland and in surrounding countries. According to Beck and many others writing on the new social subjectivity or agency that emerged in Eastern Europe in the late 80s and early 90s, and later elsewhere, it was the civil society in its political form that contributed to the formation and consolidation of democracy, constitutional democracy, after the fall of communism. The question remains, and that is now the question which is very important for us here in Poland and elsewhere, but I think that it is important in all democracies which are not sustainable, which are conceptualized in these purely statistical majoritarian terms. To what extent the emerging democracies presented a response to civic society expectations, to what extent they reflected ideas regarding justice, civic and human rights, and human dignity, the topical issues of the peaceful revolutions. Those issues and questions are becoming more important nowadays at the time of a growing danger of authoritarianism and even a wave of populism in the Central and Eastern Europe and also elsewhere. Such countries as the mentioned Hungary and Poland, once leaders in the process of democratization and initiators of an enormous political change, face, as I have already mentioned, a new danger of authoritarianism, and they are plagued by populism, as a matter of fact. Moreover, the authoritarian ambitions of the respective political leaders, like leader Orban in Hungary and leader Kaczynski in Poland, are winning the strong support, and they are winning the stronger support over time by the respective parliaments, and currently also by the considerable and growing part of the respective societies. In Poland, similarly to other countries, the social divisions is also dramatically growing between those who support the authoritarian governments and those who are in opposition to it. And as a matter of fact, those who support this authoritarian, strongly even more authoritarian government is stronger. So that part supporting is growing bigger. And therefore, the prospect of democracy is becoming quite poor. And not for democracy in this purely majoritarian statistical terms, because the new elections will be held. The government, there will be multi-party system. The statistical tests will be fulfilled. There will be open political discourse, as a matter of fact, or slightly limited. But on the part of the society, those parties which will promote this populistic gains will be supported by probably a considerable, maybe the bigger part of the population. So there will be this new government, possibly, and the authoritarian one will be chosen in a very democratic way. And then we will face the question whether we are still living in democracy or not. And according to this thin conceptualization, there will be democracy all right. On the other hand, those problems of equality of treatment, mutual recognition, the non-discrimination principle probably will be violated. We observe that these processes now towards women and especially toward immigrants and migrants, which are defined as the other against which we shall unite themselves. So that will be this richer and more robust test of democratic government will not be passed, whereas this thin majoritarian test probably will be passed all right, which is the case of Belarus, for instance, or Russia, where those populistic authoritarian governments are chosen in a fairly democratic way. There will be also, let's say, the prospect of not having this overlapping consensus, because the social divisions between the opposition to authoritarianism and the promoters of this almost authoritarian government will be even bigger. So that is this possible political development. The consensus, the prospect of some form of an overlapping consensus around democratic constitutional values or values of liberal constitutionalism, one may say, and principles vanishes, as well as recognition and inclusion of differences in the community of equals. What was, as we remember, the definition of democratic community and democratic constitution by Ronald Dworkin. So, concluding my talk, I would say, I'm not very optimistic, of course, politically speaking, but speaking sociologically, less politically, I will say in conclusion that the concept and conceptualization of civil society, as I have started my presentation, changes over time and space. The change over time, having in mind the developments in East Central Europe, Eastern Europe, as well as other countries in the world, was once focused on the concept of strong social agency. And that strong social agency, as a matter of fact, led to transformation. So that was the case of Poland, strong Solidarność movement, the Czech, strong Chapter 77, which inspired the rest of the then Czechoslovakian society, strong agency in other countries. But the concept of strong agency is not enough to conceptualize civil society nowadays, having in place the wave of new populism. The new populism is also something what could be assigned to strong agency. The people who are just demonstrating because they would like to have their wages higher, or they would like to have their pensioning earlier, We had such a demonstration in Warsaw last Sunday against the European Union because they criticize our system now. So that strong agency is very much present. But the strong agency is not enough for the modern, contemporary conceptualization of civil society. And therefore, considering the growing complexity, I think that also the social complexity connected with migration, with the changing structure of and composition of ethnicities within the political organized communities, because of the complexity of styles of lifestyles, of expectations, also racial composition, religious composition, and religious complexity, characteristic of modern society, one should reconceptualize the social agency, the strong agency, social agency, and link the concept of civil society not only with strong agency, but also with another important sociological concepts like bonding, bridging capital, as well as the concept of mutual recognition of one's own rights to live a comfortable and just life in a politically organized community. So that is a response of the theory of civil society towards the challenges of modern world. So thank you very much.